First of all, I'd like to thank the National Chief and the President of Native Women's Association of Canada for inviting me to attend, and I am very sorry that I cannot be with you. I'm here in Algonquin territory, and as your meeting, I wish you all the best and would be very happy to be involved in any future gatherings. I also want to commend all of you for taking this initiative. The issue of addressing violence against women and violence against Indigenous women and girls in particular is a huge challenge in this country. After decades and now centuries of genocidal policies that have really impacted Indigenous women and girls even more than any other women and girls in a context where we also are dealing with apparent backlash to violence against women, this is a major, major issue. So I'm no doubt stating the obvious to all of you, but I think it needs to be underscored. I also want to commend Native Women's Association of Canada and all of its members and all of the families across the country who have worked tirelessly on the issue of the missing and murdered Aboriginal women, as well as Cindy Blackstock and AFN and all of the groups have worked together to challenge the lack of appropriate education, healthcare, social services for Indigenous young people and families and Indigenous communities as a whole. All of that work is directly related to this issue. In terms of action to be taken, I see most of the Indigenous women I work with are women who have already been marginalized. Horrible, horrible experiences. 91% of the women in prison have histories of victimization. They've been criminalized, vastly overrepresented in federal penitentiaries. Now more than a third. By the end of this decade, corrections themselves say it could be as many as half of the women serving 2 years or more. That is not because they pose a risk to the Canadian public. It is because of years and years and years of them being abandoned to the streets, to prisons, and to death. And we need to change that. So there are some really basic ways, but certainly important changes that the government will have to make at all levels, in the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments. And that is to really ensure that the commitment that is in our charter for equality under Section 15, really that life is breathed into that we no longer have a situation where the government defends indefensible actions to basically disallow equality, if you will, when they're fighting at every step to challenge whether it's the access to education, whether it's ensuring protection for women and girls and boys and men for that matter, whether it's not challenging the over-policing, over-detention and over-classification of Indigenous peoples. All of those are challenges. And so one of the things we need to see is some very basic things like reinstating some of the processes, whether it's police protection, that police do come when they're called, when there is violence against women. We know that there are many communities, not just Indigenous communities, but in particular Indigenous communities, where police don't come when they're called. We know that there are communities where even when they do come, it's not until they've been called several times that they will respond. And that in many of those cases, they will respond to not only sometimes not even charge the individual who is beating up his partner or his wife or his children, but to countercharge or only charge the woman who has called for that action, particularly if she has used any kind of defensive action. With some of the changes to mandatory minimum sentences, we're seeing that in situations where women and children try to defend themselves, especially if they're trying to use force to defend themselves, they often have to grab a weapon. Doesn't mean we justify it, but the reality is the laws of self-defense, the laws that would protect individuals who are trying to escape violence, were developed at a time when women and children and Indigenous peoples had no rights. That white, privileged men made the laws, and they made them to protect their property. And so the laws of self-defense, for instance, developed around how men fight. They didn't, and mostly in barroom brawls, not about how women and children can defend themselves. So since that time, we've supposedly seen the development of new self-defense provisions. The new law that just came into force in March of 2013 would say that self-defense should apply in those situations. However, we haven't seen it tested yet, and the most recent case from Supreme Court of Canada, the Ryan case, doesn't hold us great hope that women would yet be recognized as having to defend themselves in a different way. Add to that a mandatory minimum if you use a weapon like a knife or a gun and women are trying to defend themselves, if they're in the midst of being attacked, how do they, in hand-to-hand combat, actually defend themselves? In most of those cases, we know those women end up dead. So we have to be challenging that those mandatory minimum provisions be repealed, and at the very least that a provision be put in place that allows an exception to the application of mandatory minimum rules. So those are some of the actions that I could see immediately requiring that the governments do. Provinces and territories and municipal governments could call on the federal government to change that provision to allow for the type of what's essentially referred to as an escape valve to mandatory minimum sentences, that where in fact you see the circumstances scream inequality, then we in fact should provide that kind of mechanism for a judge to have the discretion to say, in this case, even though normally it would be a mandatory minimum, clearly the history of abuse, the fact the woman was fighting for her life, all of those things should be taken into account. Secondly, I think reinstatement of some of the initiatives like the Charter Challenges program with a particular focus on Indigenous peoples would be extremely important. The Charter Challenges program was set up with and the court challenges before that, they were set up with a specific and explicit mandate to ensure that those who have the least resources to defend their charter rights have the opportunity to do so. So wiping it out essentially makes it easier to ignore charter rights. When we also have a Department of Justice, which is basically the biggest law firm in the country, whose job it is to protect the government instead of upholding the charter, which we would argue should also be a change that could be. So another recommendation could be to demand that the sorts of issues that have been recently identified by the lawyer who left the Department of Justice and exposed that the Canadian government has been allowing to go ahead laws that they know would likely not survive a charter challenge, even if there's only 5% chance it would survive a charter challenge. That should not be what we're doing. This is the charter of our country, in theory. And so if the law of the land says that we are supposed to all have equal access to the protection of the law and the application of the law, then the charter should be 100% requirement that every law be charter applicable. And so we should also demand that that be a different test. So that I see some of those things as both reactive but also in a preventive way. We know that if you don't provide opportunities for people to be contributing members of the community, you relegate them more and more to the margins and create fewer options for them. You make them more vulnerable to victimization, and if they're on the street, they're also more vulnerable to having to use force and violence themselves to survive. So you create a culture of resistance that is life-preserving. You also then criminalize that culture of resistance, and that's what we've seen particularly for Indigenous peoples. For young people, men and women, in the 30 years I've been doing this work, that is the record I've seen. And yes, we see a growing number, higher proportion of Aboriginal women being criminalized and imprisoned, but it's no less an issue for our Indigenous young people and men. And so we need to be ensuring that the resources are put in place so that we have appropriate social services, healthcare, and educational services for everybody, regardless of whether they're living in rural communities, on reserve, or in urban communities. We don't have that right now. We have an increasing gap between those who have and those who have not. And so we need to be looking at the research of people like Kathleen Leahy at Queen's University, who has talked about the increasing gender income gap, but also the increasing race income gap. And so those are things that could be being addressed. When Canada wiped out the Canada Assistance Plan, many of us were in the process of recommending improvements to the Canada Assistance Plan. Instead, we had it repealed, and provinces and territories basically given full leeway to spend the tax dollars how they wanted. And we saw in some provinces, like the one you're in, certain things like roads and developing corporate interests took priority over healthcare, social services, educational services. We need to change that and ensure that every young person has the education they need, has a roof over their head, has the food they need, and also the opportunity to be the best they can in Canada. And so we have the resources for that. Instead of continuing to waste and throw away money by warehousing more and more people in increasingly brutalizing conditions. We don't need the Ashley Smith inquest to tell us about the brutalizing conditions, or Canoe James' death in January of this year at the Regional Psychiatric Center in Saskatoon. Another inquest that we'll be undertaking about a young Indigenous woman from Manitoba who died unnecessarily, partly because her mental health issues meant that when she was having a heart attack, she wasn't believed. It was presumed that she was just trying to get attention. Those things, we don't need to get to that stage. We need to be acting well before this. So I think also continuing the support for initiatives like the one that Cindy Blackstock and Project Heart have undertaken to ensure young people have access. Not buying into the government, and I mean this is not a partisan position, but the government's and multiple governments' agenda to try and blame those who end up poor, who end up living in dire circumstances for their own behavior. We talk about it as hyper-responsibilizing those. So you withdraw the support of the state and the full retreat of state resources and supports, and then you impose state intervention when people don't comply with whether it's the laws or the policies or whatever seem, because they're trying to survive. And clearly none of that is excusable, and so we need to see those national standards in place as well, and the resourcing, most importantly. And we know, I don't know how much more research we need to show that for every dollar you spend on early intervention, whether it's good nutrition programs, good nursing programs for newborns, whether it's visiting programs and supports for parents, the less you spend on other services. We shouldn't have kids be taken into care to get access to the sorts of supports they need, whether it's childcare, whether it's additional assistance because of learning disabilities, whether it's sports programs, and yet increasingly we see the resources available if a child is taken into care that aren't made available to the families of origin and the communities of support that exist for those young people in their homes. And so those are all changes that are policy changes that can be made, legislative changes that can be made, and resourcing changes that can be made, that despite what we're hearing in terms of the rhetoric of having to cut deficits, the reality is as Kevin Page, the most recent, maybe the only ever parliamentary budget officer, has said, we have spent tens and tens and now hundreds of billions of dollars on criminalizing and institutionalizing people. It's time to spend those resources on providing an equal footing for those individuals to be contributing members of our community. And we know that every country that has better social services, healthcare, and educational services has a more equal society and has fewer people in custody, fewer people in prison, and fewer issues around public safety generally, and lower crime rates. So those are some of the recommendations that I would make, and I would be happy to work on them with all of you as the opportunities arise in the future. Thank you.